No, we did it.
Good afternoon, everyone, on this beautiful day. And I know David will be enormously appreciative that everyone's set aside time to come to this event, considering its assessment period and it's a very hot day. So it's just wonderful. And isn't it wonderful to have something to celebrate? So we're here to celebrate David's, do we say enthronement, elevation, dubbing of some form?
Conclave.
Conclave, yes, truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. So, yes, it's a celebration of David's appointment to Pastoral Chair, and it's a wonderful occasion. We're particularly grateful that David's family are here today, so welcome. As I've just said, it's, you know, that moment where you suddenly realise what he's been doing all these years, and this is a moment where, among colleagues, we celebrate David's achievements, and it's fitting for me. My name's Helen Berry. I'm a Professor of History on Founders Day, and I'm also one of the Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellors for the faculty. I can barely say that title, but it's a role that involves working across all different departments. So, you know, I get to see in the round the amazing work of colleagues here at Exeter, but today it's all about you, David. So you're naturally a very modest person, but I think it's right that we set aside some time to celebrate your achievements and to hear more about your lecture and your amazing work. So a very warm welcome to you all, and this is the inaugural professorial lecture by Professor David Thackeray, as we must now learn to call you. It's always a pleasure to do this, and in the process of crafting my introduction, I've learned a good deal about a valued colleague, his intellectual and indeed personal background. So first of all, I've discovered, for instance, that David moved to the United Kingdom from New Zealand at a young age, and that he still supports the All Blacks. So we're very much looking forward to his hacker during the refreshments afterwards. He studied for his PhD in Cambridge under the supervision of Professor John Lawrence. Proud moment for you, John. A little bit aging. When your students go on to become professors. What an accolade. So David graduated in 2009. The PhD provided the basis for his first book, Conservatism for the Democratic Age, in 2013, which focused on how the Conservative Party adapted to the development of mass party organisations during the early 20th century. Dare I say it, possibly compulsory reading for the current incumbents. We might recommend it to them. John subsequently joined Exeter in 2017, and David says that it's been great for him to get to know John better since then. Following John's recent retirement, David is very happy to be organising John Fest, a conference to celebrate his contribution to the study of modern Britain, to be held in Exeter in September with Professor Richard Toy, Professor Gary Love of Trondheim, and Dr. Florence Sutcliffe Braithwaite from UCL. John's support has been invaluable throughout David's career, and he was particularly grateful when John invited him to co-write a paper on mass observation and popular politics, which helped keep him sane during the pandemic. Following his PhD on British political history, David was keen to expand his work into the study of imperial history, and was keen when a job came up here at Exeter in 2010, name-checking both fields. Having been interviewed for a number of recent jobs and not been successful, David decided to book into, when he came for his interview, he booked into a county record office that day. That's such a historian's thing to do. I'm going for an interview and I'm just going to sneak off to the archives. So he came down to Exeter and did both. He subsequently missed the initial call offering him the job and had some difficulty finding out he'd been successful. Such a great story. David was initially employed on a temporary contract to replace Professor Andrew Thorpe, and Andrew has remained a source of support since his move to Leeds in 2019. David subsequently received funding from the AHRC to work on the history of British trade networks under the mentorship of Andrew Thompson and Richard Toy. Their experience provided a valuable insight into the world of public engagement, government, and impact, not least because the project suddenly became topical in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. This work eventually led to David's second book, Forging a British World of Trade, 2019. So at this moment, I'm conscious that I haven't really thanked anyone joining us online. Do we have any online participants or? Not yet, no, okay. So David has since worked extensively with Mark Palin, with whom he organises the History and Policy Global Economics and History Forum, which seeks to connect historians with policymakers, and Richard Toye, with whom he published Age of Promises in 2021. I was hoping to magic Richard Toye from the ether then, because I think he's
just appeared on the screen.
There he is.
You've been name checked 3 times, Richard. So welcome online, and to everyone joining us remotely today. It's great that you're here to wish David well. So the Age of Promises in 2021 explores the role of promises and programmes in British politics over the last 150 years. Richard and David set up the long-running special subject, the Yes Minister Files. I would love to take this, Perspectives on British Government since 1914 in 2016. They were subsequently joined in teaching the special subject by Richard Jobson, who's done a great deal to ensure the success of the module by sharing his expertise working in Whitehall. It's been great, says David, to see so many students from the module go on to careers in government and public policy. I think that's something we can all celebrate, with some of them coming back to talk to the new years of students. The highlight of David's conferencing career to date was giving a paper with Richard Toye in Gibraltar in 2018. Richard may have to sit on his hands, but he could possibly verify this after David's lectures. TV were running a festival in Gibraltar at the same time, and they only just made it back to the airport as various bands were staying at the same hotel and taking all the taxis, including those booked by academics. Do you want to name check any bands?
Scouting for Girls.
Oh, kudos, weren't mistaken for any of them. David says that it is, they still talk about it. Scouting for Girls still talk about that. We met those historians. David says that it's a pleasure to work in such a large and vibrant department here at Exeter, and it's been great to travel with colleagues to the NACBS in America on several occasions, which I recall. In Chicago, great time, very intellectually important. Yes, great time had by all. I would add that I've often had cause to be grateful personally, speaking for myself, for David's good humour and collegiality, sometimes under difficult circumstances. And not least when I first arrived at Exeter in the middle of the pandemic and needed help with various administrative tasks and leadership. And I think David's contribution to supporting the PGR community has been particularly welcomed and noteworthy. So thank you, David. And he's always a supportive presence, including at graduations and other significant events in the academic year. So David has led the Parliamentary Empire Leverhulme Research Project since 2021, working with Dr. Amanda Bem of the University of California at Berkeley, Richard Toye, and our PhD students, Ed Selkirk-Ford and Aaron Jenkins. And it's this project which forms the basis of the lecture today. So over to you, Professor David Thackeray.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I realise it's very much the middle of exam season and it's a particularly warm day. Before I begin, I just want to say I was deeply saddened to hear about the passing of our colleague Guy Bowman recently. I've got just a short story to tell. So I don't know, those of you who've been here sort of 10, 15 years or possibly more might remember that our history tour that we used to run at the end of Freshers Week was always a bit chaotic. I think I was in charge of it one year in about 2015, and I'd say about a third of our students got lost somewhere on the way. A third of them ended up at the RAM Museum, which is where they were supposed to go, and then a third ended up at the RAM pub. Maybe that was wishful thinking on their part, but more seriously, we felt that with the history tour then, it wasn't really saying very much about Exeter. It was just about going to different places in the city. And a few years later, we decided we really need to do something about this. And various colleagues said, well, have you heard of this guy called Guy Bowman? He's running this really excellent alternative history of Exeter tour as part of the Telling Our Stories community program that he was running. So I got in contact with Guy. It turned out that, in fact, he'd organised tours for lots of our different student groups, and he was very happy for the history department to basically kind of copy what he was doing. Not only that, I found out later on, after we'd run the tour very successfully for the first time, that he had actually organised training tours for the different lead tutors without telling me. I think that kind of really kind of showed a lot about his character and his selflessness. The Telling Our Stories project, the website's still there. If you haven't done the tour, it's a really fascinating way of getting to know a bit about Exeter's history. So, I mean, I think that was a great thing to do, and it really gave our students, a kind of much better insight into telling a story about Exeter, which might kind of go against some of their assumptions about the city. Okay, so my starting point is two events that happened in the autumn of 2024. So in October 2024, an Indigenous senator, Lydia Thorpe, made headlines around the world when she heckled King Charles III when he addressed the Houses of Parliament in Canberra, shouting out, "You are not my king, this is not your land." A few weeks later, another event happened, which perhaps wasn't quite so newsworthy, but was very interesting in its own right, and also a very unusual step to take. A representative group of Maori sent an open letter to King Charles, where they expressed their concern about recent actions by the New Zealand Parliament, which they claimed were undermining the prestige of the Crown. Now, we might ask, what's going on here? Now, clearly, it wasn't the assumption of either of these two groups that King Charles would intercede. After all, the monarch has a stated political neutrality. Nor was it very likely that they were seeking to appeal to wider opinion in Britain, which might well have been the case for such appeals in the 19th century. So despite the attempts of proponents of global Britain to forge a new trading relationship based around tariff-free Tim Tams, which are typically nice Australian biscuits, and Liz Truss photo shoots, yet people nodding their heads in agreement, Liz Truss photo shoots around Sydney Harbour, it's important to emphasise that Britain is no longer one of the leading trade partners of these countries, and China is much more important to them. If we look in more detail at this letter from Maori to the king, also start to notice some rather unusual details. There's something almost archaic about the formality of the letter. It informs the king about the recent passing of the Maori king, kind of goes into very complicated detail about constitutional language, which somebody who wasn't a specialist in the constitutional history of New Zealand would find very puzzling. So what both of these actions are really about is different Indigenous groups seeking to present their relationship with the National Parliament, recognising that Parliament is shaped by the settler colonial past, and that it ultimately has its authority with passing of representative government by the British Crown. So in the case of the Maori, the letter was a way of protesting at the actions of the national government and claiming that it undermined the Treaty of Waitangi that was created in 1840 and established a partnership between the Crown and the Maori people, and importantly, predated the passing of representative governments to New Zealand. And what's very interesting about this type of action is there's a lot of similarities here between the kind of appeals that Maori made to Queen Victoria, in the 1880s. These kind of actions will be very familiar to audiences in the 19th century. So by contrast with Lydia Thorpe, there's no such treaty between Australia's Indigenous peoples and the Crown, and her action was very much a way of seeking to remind her audience that no land or sovereignty had been ceded to the Crown. So using the examples of Australia and New Zealand, this lecture is going to consider how recent debates about settler colonial past can open up new avenues for research. And it will also reflect on some of the challenges that we face in seeking to write these histories. As Helen alluded to, it's going to bring up some examples of research from the Leverhulme Parliamentary Empire project that I've been organising over the last few years. And this is a project which focuses on how various peoples engage with Parliament while settler democracy was developing between the 1860s and 1930s. So this was a time in which parliamentary democracy became closely connected to ideas about British character and the idea of a shared British world connected by a common culture. Each of the case studies I'm going to outline today offers new insights into how ideas about British democracy developed by established political elites were contested by marginalised groups around the turn of the 20th century. The first two, the development of Maori parliaments in New Zealand, and secondly, the craze for parliamentary debating societies from various people who didn't have the vote across the empire, are taken from the Parliamentary Empire project. The last one, the campaigns for the first Indian-born MPs in Britain, is not part of this project, but addresses similar themes. So it's a bit like at the end of a Missy Elliott video from about 20 years ago when you see the first 30 seconds of the next single. So I would like to develop this case study further in a future project. But before all that, I'll go back to the start of this project. So just as the main characters in Withnail and I go on holiday by mistake, it's one of the best comedy films of all time, this was very much a project that was created out of accident and chance. So I was feeling pretty pleased with myself on the 6th of February 2020 when I pressed send on an AHRC application. My proposed project planned to look at the phenomenon of women's parliaments, focusing on the different ways in which women engaged with Parliament as an idea across the British world during the suffrage campaigns. And I'd spent a lot of time on research leave in autumn 2019, kind of talking to different groups and planning, very ambitious international research collaboration and archive visits. So a few weeks later, it was very clear that none of that was going to happen. And even if the project was funded, that it was going to need some very serious rethinking. So having completed Tiger King, being a bit of a loose end, I spent a lot of time, sort of spring, summer 2020, going over a lot of the material that I put together in planning the earlier application. And reading through this, it became clear that at the same time that unofficial women's parliaments were being set up, that there were a variety of other ways in which people were seeking to engage with Parliament in creative ways during the late 19th, early 20th century, regardless of whether they had the vote or not. This was an era when constitutional history was at the heart of curricula in schools and universities. And I decided to work with Amanda Bean in setting up an application. And she found that around this time, constitutional historians popularised the notion that Parliament had an important role in shaping English national identity over hundreds of years. So Victorian historians often refer back to supposed Teutonic ancestry of this institution, and we're very keen to trace Parliament's history back throughout medieval history, back to the idea of the Anglo-Saxon roots. At the same time, we were interested in how Indigenous people were experimenting with forms of parliamentary culture around the same time, thereby challenging the idea that concepts such as self-government were necessarily a form of racial character. It occurred to us that focusing on the place of Parliament in civic culture, away from the familiar kind of story of elections, might be a good way of writing a new history of settler democracy and challenges to its authority. And fortunately, we received funding from the Leverhulme Trust in 2021. The history of settler democracy and its contestation by Indigenous peoples and their allies is really at the core of some of the most important political debates in a number of countries today. And since the project started in 2021, our thinking has been shaped particularly by emerging public debates about the settler colonial past, especially in Australia and New Zealand. What's particularly interesting is how public debates in those countries differ a lot from well-established frameworks for understanding the history of settler democracy. And that's done much to shape our thinking. In October 2023, a proposal to establish an Indigenous voiced parliament was rejected in a constitutional referendum by a majority vote in each Australian state. Had the referendum succeeded, it would have led to the setting up of an independent representative body for First Nations peoples. If we look at the campaign website for the Uluru Statement, which is kind of core to this idea of the Indigenous voice, it very much presents this idea as the next step in a long history of attempts by Indigenous peoples and their allies to gain greater representation from the Australian states, going back to the 19th century. And this is just a screenshot of some of the examples of that timeline. So it refers to various petitions, the development of organised leagues, and also to early attempts in the 1930s to establish an independent Indigenous seat in Parliament. A little over a year later, proceedings in New Zealand's House of Representatives were briefly suspended when the first reading of a Treaty Principles Bill was disrupted by members of the Maori Parliament. The bill sought to redefine the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, which has become central to notions of co-governance and Indigenous authority, sparking a wave of protest marches in defence of the treaty in November 2024. The Libertarian ACT, or Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, which is the minority coalition partner, which introduced the bill, presents itself as an advocate of colourblind policies and argues that current legal interpretations of the treaty are based on misrepresentations and have led to Maori being accorded special rights. By contrast, opponents of the bill argue that it risks undermining long-standing notions of co-governance and partnership between Crown and Maori. These ideas were front and centre in that open letter to King Charles that I mentioned at the start of this talk, and the bill was voted down in April. I think it's very interesting here. There's a kind of clear historical consciousness amongst supporters of, amongst opponents of this bill. So we've got the Koru flag here, which becomes very closely associated with kind of growing Maori civil rights movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And we also have the flag of the United Tribes of New Zealand from 1835, which is used to show, you know, there's a pre-colonial history of kind of Maori political identity. I could talk more about that because it's very kind of contested, how significant that grouping was, but it's interesting how it features in political debate today. So much of the existing literature has tended to present transnational development of settler self-government as leading to a fundamental loss of political rights for Indigenous peoples. Such approaches tend to focus on the thought of leading British and settler intellectuals and tend to downplay the limits to settler authority, giving limited attention to questions of Indigenous adaptation and ongoing political agency. Now, while there were clearly huge asymmetries in power with the development of settler democracy, what's striking about these public debates in Australia and New Zealand is how they draw on alternative national histories of history writing, which give much more of a central place to the Indigenous contestation of settler authority in the past. So what we've sought to do with this project is to build from the insights of these national histories and present them as part of a wider interconnected debate which happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, so I've kind of gone through the abstract ideas there. I'm just going to introduce my different case studies here. So the first of these is the idea of Maori parliaments in the second half of the 19th century. So some of you might be familiar with the Maori Representation Act of 1867, which gives Indigenous men a very limited form of parliamentary representation. So there's 4 Maori seats which are set up, whereas if the number of seats have been proportionate to Maori share of the population, there should be more like 20 or so at this time. So ongoing frustrations with the lack of an effective voice lead to Maori setting up their own parliaments, which become a key means to assert ideas of Indigenous sovereignty and land rights. I think what's interesting, tracing the development of this idea, is the term Maori Parliament is very much one that's created by the English language press in the 1860s. And it's only by about the 1890s that it's co-opted by Maori who are seeking to assert their power and appeal to kind of European political elites. So we start seeing the term Parramatta Maori, literal translation of Maori Parliament, appearing in Maori language press around this time. So Maori parliaments are initially welcomed by colonists because they're seen as a way of trying to rally loyal Maori opinion at a time of heightened Indigenous resistance to settler authority. And some of these early Maori parliaments had quite a surprising reach. So this is an illustration from the Illustrated London News from 1880, which is seeking to present to its readers one of the most important of these Maori parliaments, which takes place in Orokai near Auckland in both 1879 and 1880. And in many ways, it offers quite a dignified view of what a Maori parliament was like. So we've only got 2 Europeans who are being presented as present here, a reporter, an interpreter, both of whom are funded by the government. There's a lot of focus on the dignity and effective oratory of the speaker, Rini Taifanga, who becomes MP for Northern Maori. And we've got a number of people sitting here attentively. I imagine for many British readers, this would be quite a curious scene. We've got women who are present here, so all delegates are able to record a vote. And you've also got men in working clothes, several of whom have taumoko or facial tattoos. And in many ways, this is a kind of idealized imagining of a Maori parliament, which is very much exaggerating the autonomy of the Maori who are present here. So as I said, this is funded by the government. There's very large numbers of Europeans who are present. It's just a short boat ride away from Auckland. There's a Union flag, which is on the flagstaff, but you don't see it here. But it's also very interesting if we kind of compare it with the rest of the issue, which kind of offers a much less dignified portrayal of rural islands. This is the height of the boycott movement. There's several pictures of how Ireland is being racked by boycotts. So while there's initially some sympathy towards the idea of Maori parliaments, there's a lot more settler hostility towards them over the course of the 1880s as they become more genuinely independent and they become more of a means to challenge settler authority. So settler critics often pointed to the idiosyncrasies of Maori parliaments, and they questioned whether they were truly representative of Maori opinion or whether they were just established by elites who were seeking to gull impressionable people. And a lot of this hostility is also very gendered as well. So I've got two illustrations here from a New Zealand women's magazine. The first one shows this idealised white woman who's being helped to the parliamentary summit by this MP, Newman, who has sponsored a bill which would give women the right to stand for Parliament a year after New Zealand becomes the first country to give all women the vote in 1893. The second one, by contrast, is a reference to a Maori Women's Parliament that happens the next year. And there's the claim here, it's going to be derogatory and suggesting that Maori women are only becoming involved in politics because Maori men are drunkards and can't defend their own interests. So there's this kind of highly derogatory kind of idea of this kind of savage Maori women, whereas in fact it's very much elite women who are leading this movement. So the Maori parliamentary movement reaches its apogee during the 1890s with the development of Tikota Hitanga, meaning unity, which claims to have the written support of over half of Maori. And it seeks to present itself as a potential third house, which can work in cooperation with the European or English Parliament in Wellington, as it's often referred to by Maori at this time. So this is ultimately a short-lived organisation, and it dies out after the granting of a limited form of local self-government during the early 1900s. Nonetheless, the development of this movement shows how independent parliamentary movements provided a platform for Maori to assert Indigenous autonomy, promote alternative forms of assembly based around Indigenous unity, and to resist assimilation on purely European terms. I would argue that employing the language of Parliament and linking it to expressions of Maori cultural identity rooted in pre-colonial traditions challenged the idea that parliamentary culture was necessarily a preserve of settlers and deeply rooted in the Anglo-Saxon past. And we see this even in some of the dress of people who gather for these kind of major political meetings. So these are both pictures from Papawai, which becomes the sort of unofficial Maori capital in the 1890s, and is where a lot of the later meetings of Tikota Hitanga take place. So here we've got a group gathered for a meeting in Papawai, and they're often wearing European clothes, but with traditional Maori skirts over them, and some of the women have also got tamako facial tattoos there as well. At the same time, senior national politicians feel the need to visit these Maori parliaments. So here we've got Prime Minister Richard Seddon with his wife at one of these gatherings. So I think what's interesting about Maori parliaments is they're essentially a hybrid form of political organisation, imitating some European parliamentary forms, even down to the style of the building. But but also drawing on the pre-colonial traditions of the Runanga or meeting of chiefs. And the development of Maori parliaments is also kind of linked to the development of the settler state. So with improved communications, it becomes easier to hold these kind of inter-regional meetings of Maori compared to before. And these parliaments are also very heavily supported by the Maori bilingual press, which publicise their activities. So I'm going to move on to the second of my examples, that's of parliamentary debating societies. So I think we've got a few people who are kind of modern British specialists. So you might be familiar with some of the literature on parliamentary debating societies, which become a bit of a craze in Britain during the 1880s, but die out, relatively quickly after that. And historians are often quite dismissive of these societies. They see them as a way that people can kind of imitate politicians, and they don't really see them as an effective vehicle for political education. So one of our PhD students, Aaron Jenkins, worked on these societies, and his work suggested they were in fact relatively slow to take off in Britain. That's partly perhaps due to their involvement in sectarian violence. So there's a so-called Garibaldi riot that takes place in Birkenhead in 1862. And that's because one of these societies becomes very closely associated with the Orange Order, and this leads to rioting by the local Catholic population. In fact, parliamentary debating societies first take off as a mass movement in Australia during the 1860s. They then become a common feature of civic life by the late 19th century in a range of different places, as diverse as India, Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, the Caribbean, and then across the settler colonies. And this is because debating societies provided a key means to discuss who constituted the political community and who should be excluded from it. Given they were relatively easy to set up, they appealed particularly to those who were on the margins of a political nation and were seeking to make their case for a higher form of citizenship. Demonstrating an understanding of parliamentary forms of debate was seen as a particularly good way to assert your fitness to take a full part in the political community. And I'll skip over a bit here. Okay. So these societies kind of develop a lot in Australia, partly because of anxieties about the ability of working men to kind of vote in a well-informed way. So Australia is one of the first countries in the world where there's, universal male suffrage. In Australia, parliamentary debating societies continue to flourish into the 1900s, partly because they provide a means to discuss the key issues of the day, such as federation, but they also take on new forms, partly because of the development of women's parliaments, such as this one which was set up by Vida Goldstein in Melbourne. So Goldstein is one of the first women who stand for election to the Australian Senate in 1902. And she uses this women's parliament as a way of seeking to publicise her cause. So she states that if ladies are admitted to parliament, it's something to know that they will take their seats thoroughly prepared and armed for debate. And I haven't got time to talk about it here, but this idea of a women's parliament is taken up by a variety of different suffrage groups. So we see Christabel Pankhurst, for example, referring to the kind of Caxton Hall meetings of the WSPU as women's parliaments, which are kind of meeting at the same time as the men's parliaments in Westminster. Within the wider empire, debating societies could provide a space to critique national and imperial policy. They have a particular longevity in South Africa, which might be partly explained by the ethnic and linguistic diversity of that country. And they provide a means to kind of train yourself in public debate, often in the second language. So Sol Plaatje, the first General Secretary of the South African Native National Congress, the forerunner of today's ANC, takes his first steps into political life as a member of the South Africans Improvement Society, which is established in 1895 in Kimberley. Parliamentary debating societies can both promote the ethnic, social divisions of colonial life, or they can provide a means to challenge them. So in the 1900s, the Calcutta Parliament attracted members of the city's multi-ethnic business interests. These included British journalists such as B.G. Horniman, a forthright anti-globalist who was deported from India after leaking details of the Amritsar massacre to the British press, as well as leading members of local Asian society from the British Indian Association who hosted the Parliament. By contrast, the Bombay Parliament, which met around the same time, confined its membership to Europeans. It was claimed that these meetings were started with a view to training the younger European to take his place in the councils of empire in India. Unlike the non-party Calcutta Parliament, debates ran along British party lines, and this led to kind of very bizarre practices, such as each member being assigned a British constituency and either being a member of the Conservative, Liberal or Labour parties. So most of my focus here so far has been on the subject of settler democracy and how those on the political margins sought to make their case for better political representation. However, the example of parliamentary debating societies in India reminds us that discussions about the character of settler democracy formed only part of a wider debate about political representation and race across the empire. My last example considers the first two Indian-born MPs the first two Indian-born MPs who represented British constituencies during the late 19th century. I'm interested in how both men sought to appeal to audiences in Britain and India in different ways, and plan to use this as the starting point for a new project on racial identity, representation, and British electoral politics in the long 20th century. So Navroji and Bonegri had strikingly different political personalities, but they represented constituencies in London that were little more than 2 miles apart in the late 19th century. Navroji was one of the founders of the Indian National Congress, and his decision to stand for election to Westminster was very much based on this idea of seeking to publicise the aims of the newly founded Congress. He later developed a very strident and influential critique of British policy in poverty and un-British rule in India, which accused Britain of draining India's wealth on a massive scale. Bonegri, by contrast, stressed his support for British rule in India. He also used his status as an MP to highlight the injustices which Indians faced in South Africa. So I'm interested in how both men, through their presence in London politics, opened up debates about the character of British democracy, both in England and India, as well as how they sought to appeal to different audiences in different ways. Now, with Navroji, at times he presented himself as a prospective member for India, talking about how he's not just going to represent Holborn, but can also be a voice for 250 million of your fellow subjects. At other times, such as in his election address, he very much tried to avoid the idea of being a potential member for India and appeared to be much more of a straightforward, conventional liberal and parliamentary candidate. So his election address starts, to many of you, I'm a man of strange name and race. I'm not going to set out features of Indian reform, but I hope to be able to talk about that if I'm elected to the House of Commons. And it then proceeds to offer a very conventional Gladstonian liberal programme. However, what really leads to Nauroji becoming a very prominent public figure is the notorious comments by the Conservative Prime Minister of the day, Lord Salisbury, when he states, "I doubt if we have yet got to that point of view where a British constituency would elect a black man." So Nauroji had ultimately been unsuccessful in Holborn in 1886, but he now becomes a very prominent figure. So some people pointed to the fact that as a Parsi, Nauroji had a relatively light complexion in contrast to Lord Salisbury. And he becomes a particularly popular figure within some of the different kind of liberal popular organisations. This is the Liberal and Radical magazine from University of Bristol National Liberal Club collections, which shows how Nauroji becomes this very visible figure. So it's not only a debate that's happening in Britain at this time. In 1889, the pro-Congress Varna Brothers Press in Lucknow publishes a book about the black man controversy, which includes very extensive quotes from the British press. So Nauroji subsequently wins a seat by a very narrow majority in 1892. And he has a hugely successful celebratory tour to India afterwards. By contrast, when Bonegri returns to India after winning his seat in 1895, there's much more of a subdued reception to him. A Bombay publisher sought to bring home this distinction when it published a book in 1897 featuring excerpts from the Indian press, presumably with a view to educating readers both in Britain and India. So this is a cartoon from the start of the book, which presents Bonegri's supporters as seeking to inflate him. By contrast, Nauroji, even though he's just lost his seat in the British Parliament, stands way above him as the member for India and the Grand Old Man of India. So the Grand Old Man is a term which is used at the time to refer to the British Liberal leader, William Gladstone. It's being co-opted here. So the controversy over whether Bonegri or Nauroji could be seen as the member for India reminds us that Westminster at this time was fundamentally an imperial parliament. And this was a time in which large numbers of people from wider empire decided to produce petitions to Westminster seeking redress. In many ways, Nauroji was a conventional Liberal MP, but he was one who sought to develop on Gladstone's humanitarian politics as a means of highlighting the plight of the Indian people to people in Britain. Likewise, Bonegri was someone whose rhetoric was very much unremarkable for a Conservative MP of the time, yet he also hoped to use his place in Parliament to highlight the injustices that Indian communities faced within the settler empire. Okay, so to begin to wrap up, in the aftermath of the recent Australian referendum, supporters of the Voice, Indigenous Voice, were quick to criticise what they perceived as a lack of civic education amongst their countrymen. The slogan, "If you don't know, vote no," appears to have been a particularly effective weapon in the armoury of the No campaign. By contrast, the pro-Indigenous Voice slogan, "History is calling," does not appear to have had the same kind of traction. However, I would argue that far from there being a deficit of civic knowledge on display in recent debates about the settler colonial past in Australia and New Zealand, what's striking is how much scholarship that's been produced over recent decades has really informed those debates. Let's just take one example here. So William Cooper, who was a relatively obscure figure 30, 40 years ago, has received his first full-length biography in 2022. He's also someone who featured very heavily during the referendum campaign in articles for the Guardian and The Conversation, and he's now very much understood as the father of this call for an Indigenous voice in Parliament. You can also download his kind of main communications with the Australian government in the 1930s, which have all been digitised and are available via the National Archives of Australia. Across the Tasman, the Waitangi Tribunal has also done much to uncover histories of Indigenous contestation of settler authority, and kind of has really offered us new perspectives on this subject. However, as in many countries, the outlook for those who seek to provide new histories of settler democracy in Australia and New Zealand is gloomy due to a background of cultural conflicts and funding regimes which are undermining core humanities research. In late 2024, it was announced that humanities and social science scholars will no longer be eligible to apply for New Zealand's Marsden Fund, their equivalent of the UK RI. It's surely ironic that the New Zealand government's claim that the fund would be repurposed to support science researchers who are looking to create a better country for us all, that's just about humanities, occurred at a time when the colonial legacy was so central to the national conversation. It may be tempting to view the development of settler democracy as necessarily leading to whole-scale closing down of opportunities for political expression amongst the politically marginalised. Instead, in this lecture, I've sought to demonstrate that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time in which a variety of audiences sought to assert the right to take part in British democracy, in the UK, the wider settler empire, and beyond, even if there were substantial obstacles to their doing so. If we move beyond the familiar territory of electoral history and efforts to expand the franchise, I think we can uncover a richer history of how people engage with Parliament on an everyday basis. The development of settler democracy encouraged the politically marginalised to develop new forms of imperial literacy, to copt a term from Indigenous studies. Such activities necessarily legitimised Parliament's authority, which means that some historians have in the past seen them as not truly radical or have seen them as a form of co-option by the state. However, I would argue that they could also provide a powerful means to hold the British and settler state and its claims to moral authority to account. In the process, they laid the groundwork for contemporary debates about the Constitution and the state's relations with the historically marginalised. So the debate about how to best promote an Indigenous voice to Parliament is nothing new. In many ways, it has rich roots in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Thank you, David. I never know how to judge whether I stand next to you and then it gets a bit weird because I'm way too close, or stand over here and now I seem very far away, but I'm going to stick with being over here. So I think I'm going to be talking mostly to you guys just for a second. My name's Naomi Sykes. I'm the head of department and I'm an archaeologist, which means I know nothing about what David has been talking about. So what I'm going to do, Helen at the beginning gave a kind of origin story of how Professor Thackeray came about. I didn't know any of that, so that was a beautiful thing to hear. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I know as head of department and archaeologist. What I know is that David, ever since I took over as being head of department, has been the most fabulous colleague, incredibly kind and incredibly supportive. Helen talked about how, you know, in your origin story, you've been mentored by the greats, by John and by Richard. in my mind, you are the great. And what I see is you are a phenomenal mentor of lots of others in your role as SAL. That means senior academic lead. Okay, so he's mentoring lots of people. So, yeah, I already knew all of that about you, about how fabulous you are. What I didn't realize is your research, which for me, it's been a thrill and a privilege to see the work that you're doing and to hear just how important it is on so many different levels. Normally, I ask a really dumb question now as an archaeologist going like, so on the basis of what you've learned about the past, what do you prognosticate for the future? And it's always, everyone goes like, what a dumb question. But in this case, I just want to ask, is the arts and humanities funding coming back? That's what I need to know. Will it come back? What a big question.
I mean, possibly with the kind of new majority for the Labour Party in Australia, I think there's a better situation. There is, they were already talking about review. I'm sure people will be familiar with this, that there was a differential tuition fee that was established in Australia. So there'll be higher fees for humanities degrees because they're seen as somehow less value than sciencey stuff.
It's all sounding very familiar to the UK as well. Is it coming back here, David?
So,
that's what I was asking.
so I think the position might be improving in Australia, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah. I know, as I said, I always ask the dumb question.
This was kind of like designed as quite a cheap project to run in some ways. When we got the funding, we just didn't know when we'd be able to go to the archives. So we've kind of done a lot with the digital. So I mean, maybe that kind of offers some kind of hope.
And for your new project as well, right? That potentially building on that.
Yeah. Bristol's very good for that.
Yeah. Wait, you're not leaving for Bristol?
No.
Okay. All right, just double check.
Lots of nice archives.
Sure. In that case, enough dumb questions from me. We've got a few minutes where we can open it up to others if you guys have any questions. Was that just the back of the head rub? It looked like you were reaching. I mean, I've got one. It might I think this one is less dumb. You showed the graphic of the Maori parliaments, and you pointed out that there were women there. My question is that representation more kind of demonstrating progressiveness, or that, you know, this is a backward group of people, you know, we shouldn't have women in parliament? So I just wanted to get your sense of what that, it seemed a very deliberate, they were right in the front, whether you have a sense of how that was being used.
Yeah, it's a very good question in terms of why that's featuring in a British magazine. I mean, the kind of long answer is that there are a lot of prominent Maori women who are getting very actively involved in politics, partly because a lot of them are landholders in their own rights, which is very different from kind of European settler women. So land politics is basically the kind of the key ways in which Maori get involved in politics, and women are very much part of that. I think what's interesting is the assumption, you know, in 1894 that if there is going to be a woman MP, she's necessarily going to be European. I mean, it could, well, you know, it could just as likely have been the case that the Maori women could have stood for Parliament and, you know, potentially won one of those seats. I mean, a lot of them are kind of closely related to men who have also held those seats over time. So I mean, that would be really fascinating. There's a kind of alternative history if the first kind of woman MP in the British Empire would be Indigenous Maori. That would be really interesting.
David, first of all, kudos to you for including a slide of with Nell and I. Interesting that, again, the photograph of the Maori Parliament was not in a marae, and the illustration in the London Illustrated News was certainly not a Maori building. Do you think the reason for that may have been that the parliaments didn't have universal support amongst the Maori people?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, this building, is paid for from money given by the New Zealand government. So it's clearly not like a Mariah, a kind of like a kind of local meeting house, which would have a lot more status in Maori culture. So yeah, I think that's definitely the case.
There may have been objection to them meeting in the marae.
Yeah, absolutely. And also as well, there'd be kind of questions about kind of the local authority and kind of outsiders coming in. Yeah.
It sort of links to my question actually, which was about you mentioned when you were showing this that there is a Maori language news press from this period. So I suppose the question is, well, firstly, has it survived? Has it been digitized? Can you read it? And do you think that it might address these sorts of questions about the debate that's going on, not through the whole of the Maori community, but as a sort of Maori public sphere, about the pros and the cons of working with the settler state or not? Have you been able to look into it?
I mean, I don't have the language skills. There's a flourishing bilingual press around this time, so I've made use of that. I mean, I can do keyword searches, but I mean, they're quite limited.
Can ChatGPT do it? I mean, in other words, you use technology.
Yeah. But I mean, there's a very significant press, and yeah, a lot of it's been digitized. I mean, one of the things that makes it easier to look at the Australian New Zealand material was a lot of it's publicly funded.
Yeah.
There isn't a paywall like there is for a lot of the kind of British.
That's true for Australia too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was when you were mentioning this, to follow on point, John, when you were mentioning this, when we were discussing this slide, you were talking about the relative balance between tradition, sort of Indigenous tradition, and the imperial parliamentary culture that was being sort of adopted. Where do you think that balance lay in these kind of meetings, these gatherings of Parliament? Was it,
Yeah, I mean, they're very much a hybrid organisation. I think they change over time because they are very much. There's a lot of government involvement. There's some very cringeworthy attempts to kind of set up Maori kind of local councils in the 1860s, which are kind of very paternalistic. Don't really get very far. Yeah, I think they're very much hybrids. I think maybe historians in the past have kind of talked a lot about this kind of idea of authenticity. And I kind of think that some of the work from Indigenous studies that I've looked at, which kind of tries to avoid that and kind of talks about them as kind of form of adaptation, as a way of trying to respond to kind of developing state. I think that kind of works more effectively.
The question, does the Maori community use the term genocide, and is it popular, this narrative of genocide?
I'm probably not the best advised person to do that. I mean, there's a lot more public commemoration of the New Zealand Wars. So there's that's kind of got official recognition recent years. It's a very difficult subject because these wars aren't solely Europeans versus Maoris. You often have kind of kupapa, different groups of Maori who are kind of fighting on the side of the British. So it's kind of quite a complicated and very sort of sensitive subject to the present day. But it's not used the same way as it might be, say, for Tasman, kind of what's happening in Tasmania, in Australia in the early 19th century.
Thank you.
Anybody else? In that case, that there are refreshments, but before we charge the door, I want to say thank you again, David, for such a brilliant and thought-provoking presentation. I also want to say huge congratulations for achieving being the newest professor on the block. So let's give it up for the new Professor David Thackeray.
But it was one of those ones, one moment away, they still bring you. Second study. So that was me. So, yeah, that's like there, yeah, like, so there was